Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all on this last day of the exchange. Unbelievable how time can fly when you're having a good time. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Angie Fiesel, and I'm joined by some amazing guest speakers who I'll introduce you to here shortly. As you are joining, feel free to set your profiles with your name, preferred pronouns, and we'll get started. And Marina, if you could go on down to the acknowledgement slide 3. I just want to kind of start by saying that as we enter this session, we're going to have the goal of looking at what are changemakers and how to be changemaker educators. So we'll be touching on how important reflection is on ourselves, on our identities, our positionality and relationship to the systems in which we're operating, as a way of understanding the current context as we dream of and try to create more sustainable futures for the common good of all. But before we look at the present and consider the future, it's really important to also reflect back and to really appreciate the histories, the peoples, the cultures of our respective locations and our institutions. And so I'd like to open by acknowledging and recognizing that the conference host, Ashoka U, is located on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Natchitoches Nation, which then became part of the Piscataway Nation. I invite you to acknowledge and to reflect on the land, the first people, the histories of your own context, both their rich heritages, as well as any inequalities and injustices that existed and that may still need to be overcome. As we are seeking to bring Changemaker education to life today, I'm pleased to introduce the session and our speakers. With that, Marina, if you want to advance us to the next slide. I am Angie Fiesel. I am a consultant currently and former director of Changemaker Campus at Ashoka U. I was also one of the lead authors amongst many authors and institutional contributors to Ashoka U's latest publication, Becoming a Changemaker Institution, which you see here. For those of you who may not be as familiar, Ashoka U was really founded and has carried on a vision and an aspiration of advancing change making, not just as one piece in one class as a standalone idea, but as an entire educational pathway across the institution, as well as a way of being, a strategy and a way of operating and a culture as across the institution, as you heard Marina Kim speak about in the very first keynote earlier this week. And so over the last 12, 13 years, in collaboration with hundreds of institutions and thousands of stakeholders, there's been this rich learning lab, and together we've really been able to kind of synthesize across that experience to codify in this guidebook. Really, what does it mean to be a changemaker institution and a changemaker educator and changemaker education? And so we're excited today to talk a little bit about the idea of changemaker education and what it means to be a changemaker educator specifically. And we'll be drawing from some of those key frameworks. And so as we advance to the next slide, we'll just kind of summarize two key themes that we're going to be addressing in our session today. And that is, what is a change maker? Why is it so important to be cultivating them? And what are the implications on us as educators? The second key theme is, once we've kind of unpacked a little bit about change maker, well, that's really core, because if we want to be a changemaker educator, we've got to have that as a foundation first. So we'll be exploring then what are the key qualities that we've observed for changemaker educators. And here's some lived experience and stories from our guest speakers, and hopefully you as well through the chat and through some questions or comments that you may have for them in kind of a panel discussion that we'll enter into. So with that, I would love to introduce our speakers, and on the next slide, we'll have their headshots and titles for your available for you, but I'm going to just turn it over to them and ask each of these dear colleagues and friends to introduce themselves, their kind of name, if you guys, your institution, any roles that you want to kind of talk about that you're currently in, and maybe a passion project, so we get to know a little bit about each of you. I'm going to ask Dustin, would you mind to go first?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that framing, Angie. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're clicking in from. My name is Dustin. I use he, his pronouns. I'm calling in from New York, and I'm currently a graduate student studying higher education at Harvard University. I'm also an Ashoka U cheerleader. I've had the chance to work on the Ashoka U team, and it's just been such a pleasure being a part of this exchange. A passion project that I've been working on. Angie, I've been trying to get really good at puzzles. So my partner and I have bought several puzzles that are not done yet, but hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll have a chance to piece those together. And then I'll pass it off to Becky.
Hey everyone, I'm Rebecca Ottner Becky. I'm a professor of practice and director of strategy and engagement at the Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking, which is at Tulane University, and we're located in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is where I'm calling in from. I would say my passion project right now is kind of related to my sense of like what it means to be in community and really being really rooted in my place. And so a couple of years ago, I bought a house in New Orleans. And pretty much every weekend since then, I've had some sort of house project. And so the wall behind me was the most recent indoor project that I finished. And I just love, being on my block and connecting with my neighbors with that. John?
I'm John Isham. I am calling in from Middlebury, Vermont, and I'm just so thrilled to be here in this wonderful company. As I shared with Marina, bittersweet, but also a time for celebration for so many of us who have benefited from all the extraordinary vision of Marina and Aaron and Angie and all the other good people who created Ashoka U. A passion project for me is, I think, just to get more grounded. I live on a 10-acre property here in rural Vermont, and like most of you have had a challenging time over the last year, so I'm trying to get back to basics as the days get longer in terms of how to live and what matters. So that's indeed what matters to me, let's put it that way. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you all so much for the introductions, and can't wait to dive in a little bit more deeply and tease out some great ideas together. Before we do so, we also want to get to know some folks in the room, and just by looking at the chat, it's so much fun to see the participant names who've joined, and that many of you are already connected with each other. And so great to have you all here, and anxious for you to share and get your voice into the room, the virtual room as it were. So we're going to do kind of a chat exercise. So if you're able to navigate to chat, what we'd love to do, I'm going to ask a few specific kind of prompts. I'll give you a prompt or a phrase. For example, my name is, and then I'll ask you to type in your response into the chat. Hold off on hitting enter until, let's say, about 20 seconds. I'll give you a cue, and then you can hit enter. And that will give everyone a chance to kind of come up with their own answer first before we respond. Marina, if you'll advance to the next slide, that'll give people instructions and just kind of a reminder of that. And with that, please get ready. We'll love to surface a little bit about your motivations and your ideas about changemaking education. So our first prompt, one thing or value I learned from a mentor or educator is. One thing or value I learned from a mentor or educator is. If you're ready, maybe give me a signal, visual signal, hands off the keyboards. Okay, let's go ahead and hit enter. Oh, wow, I love this. So many that I have to scroll back up. We've got deep listening, humility, humor, digging deep to root causes. Long-term change takes patience, permission, lifelong learning, rigor, empathy, patience, how to find my own voice, incredible. More patience, lots of patience in here, trusting instincts, diversity, assuming positive intent, not to undervalue myself or my own potential. being open, living a life of impact, critical thinking, believing in myself. Oh my goodness. Thank you all. That was so rich. And I love all the words that are floating. We've got more. So let's keep going with our next prompt. Number 2, one of the personal values I try to bring into my work or classroom. One of the personal values I try to bring into my work or classroom. Feel free to do a thumbs up if you're ready to go. We've already got 2, so let's go ahead and hit enter if you're ready. All right, so trying to bring into the classroom or work, humility, optimism, core qualities of change making, vulnerability, congruency, inclusivity and optimism, inclusion and confidence, hope, honesty, vulnerability again, integrity, vulnerability, love and honesty, valuing students, paying them and showing that through paying, more inclusion, connection, humility, honesty, empathy, and empathy. Amazing. All right, as an educator or mentor, I believe. As an educator or mentor, I believe. And feel free, if you're ready, whenever you would like to, go ahead and hit enter. Lived experience is a valuable form of knowledge or expertise. Love it. I think we'll dig into some of that today. Believe in the promise of the next generation. That's that spirit of change-making optimism. Everyone's potential to make a difference. Everything is possible. The power of being happy. Amen. I need a little bit more of that every day. Social change is always possible. Everyone has passion. Follow your dreams. Everyone has something to contribute. Students are wise teachers. Listening, the future is filled with amazing opportunities. Center the student. Positive change is possible. Power dynamics influence everything. Critical for transformative change. That young people bring the energy we need in this moment, valuing the student and their energy, the power of change making for inclusivity. Impact is always the way, and students know best. So a lot of student centric here, which is amazing, and love to see that. Next prompt. I hope to help students, colleagues cultivate. I hope to help students and colleagues cultivate. What are you trying to foster? And go. Some growth, curiosity, hope, compassion, collaboration, purpose-driven life, community, love and action, more growth, confidence, open-mindedness, authenticity and confidence, incorporating community engagement in one's work, a belief that we all have a role in change making. Great. Let's bring this to kind of the current state. Right now, I think students need. Right now, I think students need. Agency, go ahead and feel free to hit enter. Adaptability, empathic educators, connection, compassion, understanding, one-on-one attention, space, inspiration, help and healing, an important one, encouragement and hope, closely related, orientation, mentorship, agency and confidence, flexibility for sure in these times, truth. Amazing. And our last one, just to bring us to a close for this activity and set us up for our conversation today. Why were you here? So I was interested in this topic because. And go ahead and hit enter when you're ready. So we've got the rockstar speakers. I couldn't agree more. They were intentionally chosen for that. I need to improve and stretch. Great, appreciate that, as we all are seeking to do so. This is how we change the world. It's enduring and impactful. Again, more the speakers, I want to effectively share the power of change making with my students. So wonderful. Hope. Yeah, let's hope that we are able to bring a dose of that in today's conversation. Growing in practice as an educator, learning with community, want to move colleagues, rock stars, opportunity to learn. Fabulous. Thank you all so much for sharing with us a little bit about your intentions and about your aspirations for your classroom, as well as for this session. Whether this is your first exchange and the idea of change making is a little bit newer, hopefully this session will provide a little bit of a foundation or a framework to kind of think about. And if you have been, I see many seasoned Changemaker educators in the room, hopefully this will provide kind of a synthesis of some of the core ideas that you've been practicing, you've observed others practicing, that maybe will become a framework that's useful for kind of a discourse as you're advancing this with your colleagues on campus. And given all of the wealth of the experience in the room, if your energy is high enough, we welcome your questions and your comments through chat, as well as we kind of weave together some personal stories and lived experience. So with that, let's dive into change making. If I could have Marina advance to the next slide. And one more, please. So we're going to start with a little bit of lived experience, and we want to kind of turn to Dustin now. And Dustin, you are an incredible change maker and student leader, and you're also in a Changemaker educator role. So you wear a lot of different hats, and I would love if you could just kick us off with a bit of a story. Tell us about how you came to embrace change making. What does that mean to you? And then lead us into kind of like your student journey. How did you express change making or come to enact change making through your university time as well? So over to you, Dustin. Just a small task.
Thank you so much, Angie. And I'm going to encourage you to ask me and probe questions if I don't hit anything. To ground this story, I want to share a moment that I've been reflecting a lot about, which is the moment that I learned that magic didn't exist. I remember that I was 9 years old. I was sitting in the lunchroom, and my friends and I were talking about who was going to receive their letter from Hogwarts. And I remember a lunch lady coming over and sharing with us that it would never happen. And I think ever since that moment, I've been trying to regain or yearn for the sense of magic. And I think in moments like these, in moments where I joined the Ashoka U community, in moments where I've had a chance to meet Changemaker educators like yourselves, it's reminded me that magic is real. And the work that we're doing is really magic, and helping others see their magic and understand that change is possible. So I'll start there, because I think that really does ground a lot of my story and a lot of what brought me to this position. As a way of introducing my human bio, I can't not talk about my parents. My parents are two Taiwanese immigrants that came to the United States in pursuit of their higher education. Without their sense of possibility, without their sense of hope, none of this would have happened. And I had a chance to grow up in a really culturally rich and diverse community. I grew up and I was born in Queens, New York, if folks are familiar, one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world. And I remember growing up and sitting on my mom's lap, looking at a webcam. It feels like that's the norm now, but that was so special to see my grandparents halfway around the world. And that image of being one foot in America, my heart is also in Taiwan, this sense of growing up in an immigrant community, became who I was. I cared about what was happening around the world. I cared about making a difference, because the opportunity to make change impacted people that I cared about. That sense of deep connection and embeddedness to the global world is something that I still carry today. And it was fundamental in terms of my development as what I consider change making. My mom is my superhero. And I'm sure there are lots of moms on this call that will resonate with that, but I truly think that my mom is my superhero. I like to say that growing up with her was the longest internship that I ever had. My mom's community involvement in community-based organizations was just remarkable. I mean, she taught me what change making was. She taught me what community engaged work looked like. She taught me what ethical community engagement was, even before I knew what those words were. And she brought to light the idea that an individual could really make a profound difference. One of my first memories is of my mom coaching elders in our community who didn't speak English, on how to, one, coach them through the citizenship process, but two, how to communicate with their grandchildren. And the moments that I remember from my childhood were these elders running into her office, telling her, hey, I had a chance to talk to my grandchild today for the first time, ask them how school was. or opportunities where they said, hey, this is the moment where I got my citizenship and it transformed my entire generation, entire family, entire sense of dignity, that I began to be really curious about the impact that an individual could make on really the world. In these moments, I really saw the power of individuals to make magic real. And I truly believe that it was through those moments, those pathways, that I got really engaged in the opportunity to help young people, help my peers see themselves as change makers. I grew up in political organizing organizations. I found my voice as a student activist coordinator, and I ended up heading to college. I chose Cornell University because I could study industrial and labor relations, which sounds really esoteric, but at the end of the day, it was studying social movements. And the opportunity to apply that directly in my leadership opportunities on campus was profound. When I got to campus, I noticed two things. That so many of my peers had lost their sense of magic, that so many of my peers didn't have that opportunity to apprentice in an environment like the one that my mom created for me. And what I found was that the engaged programs at Cornell, the opportunity that Cornell had as an Ashoka U Changemaker campus helped unlock those things that were missing. I had an opportunity to serve as a trustee. I served on the board of trustees at Cornell University. And through those conversations, I noticed the opportunity for higher education, for these institutions to catalyze change, to catalyze belief, to catalyze change makers that we need to combat some of our toughest issues. And I think it's within that experience that brings me to my roles now. Being a graduate student studying higher education, what works? What can we expand? What's the opportunity on our campuses? Working in the Social Innovation Center at MIT, helping young people have the resources that they need to see their magic. And now, having the great honor of serving as the U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations, working with students across the country in a Changemaker Educator role. And at the end of the day, I think it starts with developing that hope, developing that sense of belief. I truly believe that those who make social change don't just wake up one day and do so. The capacity to make change is built over time, and those small moments matter. Those moments where an educator says, hey, you did that and this is possible. Let me give you the resources that you need to make that happen. The capacity to make change grows in an individual over time as those small changes lead to gradually larger ones. So it's in that vein that I'm just so excited to be part of this conversation, so excited to be part of this panel. Angie, I'm going to throw it back to you to see if there's anything that I missed or anything that I can zoom in on.
No, so incredible. Thank you so much, Justin and Rupe. I really appreciate you just sharing your experiences and key influences for you. And as I kind of think about that, I think that how amazing to have had that early influence at kind of a young age, and then having that kind of fan the flame, I think, when you went into college as well. And just think of the trajectory that those early influences have had, which makes my mind go to what are the pathways we need from K through 12 all the way through higher education. But as we zoom into the university experience specifically, can you maybe just share a story or two of your time at Cornell, of how you engaged and activated your own agency or worked with other students to activate them?
Angie, what a great question. I had the deep privilege of serving as an engaged ambassador, which was part of our community engagement office. And I noticed the power of creating communities of social change, creating communities of change makers on college campuses. And I realized that it was through peer-to-peer contact. It was through that opportunity for mentorship. It was through that opportunity for partnership where that became possible. I remember having conversations with students, with my peers, and unpacking what they wanted to do, their purpose, what they hope to see in the world. And it often started with a question or an invitation to imagine the world that we wanted to live in. Oftentimes we're never asked what world we want to build. Oftentimes we're never asked the world that we hope to live in, the world we hope to build. And I think so often it starts there, from an ability to imagine. A conversation that always stays with me is when I was a senior, I had a chance to talk with a freshman who gave me a vivid picture of the vision of the world that she hoped to build. In her personal experiences, she had faced incredible inequities in her education system, and she wanted to build back better. She wanted to transform what could be possible for the folks in her community. And it was in that conversation that we started to unpack how her personal gifts and skills really tied to the challenge that she hoped to overcome in society. And in that, she found her own voice and her own pathway forward. And I'm just so thrilled to say that today she's pursuing that as a senior now in college, taking that on full time. And it was in those conversations, in those moments where we sort of suspend our idea of what is possible, that we start finding our roles in change making.
That's an incredible, I can't imagine the seed that was planted in those conversations and how that's coming to fruition. And really just appreciate your point about kind of peer-to-peer mentorship and the role that students play. I think you've teased out and you've given us a few practical examples of change-making education already. Even before we go there, we're gonna suspend those for a minute. And just, I wanna kind of turn to John and Rebecca as well. If there are any things that sparked for you that you wanted to kind of maybe either comment on, and or if you think of specific examples of Changemaker students in your kind of programs or in your teaching that you would like to pepper into this conversation to illuminate the idea of what is a Changemaker.
Becky, do you want to jump in?
So there's one thing that Dustin was talking about right at the beginning of his story that I thought was really interesting in both the differences and similarities with my experience around the role that his parents and his community had in shaping this. And I think I also wish my ethics were strongly shaped by my parents, but one of the differences is that I grew up in a really homogenous community, and diversity was never something that we really talked about, and difference was never something that we really talked about. And sometimes I think was kind of actively not discussed. And I also found that moving to New Orleans, which is a majority Black city, even though I was on a historically and predominantly white campus, opened up new opportunities for me in terms of my identity as a change maker. And so I just think that's an interesting thing that we could explore further. And that's a kind of a loss that I feel from my childhood experience of not being able to have that relationship across difference and how that might have shaped my earlier experiences.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, Becky. We're just being in touch with our own identities and those influences and how they shape our perspectives and our Changemaker education practices as well, right? These are intrinsically linked. Yeah. John, anything you want to add? And no pressure if not.
Yeah, I will add, as a twist on this story, echoing Becky in particular. So I grew up in a homogenous area, Fairfield County, Connecticut, mostly white folks, pretty wealthy area at the time. But my story briefly illustrates that one, as an educator, can overcome the lack of diversity, overcome the homogeneity, and get to the heart of the importance of looking at the world through other eyes and beginning, say, a path towards empathy. So 2 8th grade teachers, early 70s, private school, said, enough of American history, let's do something different. Their headmaster, who was a traditionally trained Princeton grad, nevertheless said, these are those times. And so in the early 70s, I was lucky enough in 8th grade to take a course called anthropology, but it was really much bigger than that even, where we studied the Harlem Renaissance, we studied prisons, we studied the indigenous groups in South Africa. Kind of everything was possible, and these 2 wonderful teachers, still very much alive and part of my life, were asking us to do what I just said, look at the world through other eyes. And I always come back to that year. 8th grade is a formative time in one's development, when my own path that's now brought me to Middlebury really began. And I currently now, in the wake of George Floyd and in the wake of Black Lives Matter and so much that I've learned from in the last few years personally, the film 13th, the book Cast, the list goes on in terms of my own coming to awareness about issues of race in this country more recently. I am really pushing my students hard, Middlebury being a historically white college, to do what those 8th grade teachers did for me. So while I stand in front of a classroom as a straight, white, male, Christian born, cisgendered, all that stuff, I will bring in from the beginning videos of people who are not like me. I am really prioritizing videos from strong Black leaders, Black women, setting the stage for a class, despite the fact that such folk can't be with us physically, COVID being only part of that, but really making sure that those voices are heard from the beginning, every day. And I'm dutifully thinking about, honestly, young men like me 40 years ago or more, who, like me, were born into a certain kind of wealth and homogeneity. I want them to have their eyes open too, even as I support folks of a range of backgrounds and demographics and interests and sexualities and so forth. So it's a kind of revived calling for me. And I just am so thankful for those 8th grade teachers. I know I wouldn't be doing this. I know I wouldn't have embraced change making without them.
Gosh, thanks so much for Rebecca and Jonathan both sharing a little bit more about your own personal stories, and just incredible about those early influences and how they shape not only the personal identity, but your how you want to show up in the classroom and the influences that you guys want to make. I'm going to move us forward just now to kind of synthesize some of the key attributes of change making as, again, just a foundation. I think we've heard both through our opening chat, you all identified so many of them already. I think we heard them kind of lived out in some of Dustin and Rebecca and Jonathan's own stories. Marina, would you go ahead and share the slide for us at this point? And then we'll take it off again when we get to the next kind of panel conversation. But we're going to move to slide 12, I believe it is. And just as Marina is bringing it up, I can kind of give a little context for Ashoka U a few years ago developed a publication and came up with a list of changemaker qualities. And you see those summarized on this slide. This is in preparing students for rapidly changing world. And these really evolved over the team looking at and exploring outcomes and curriculum for social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and change making, doing kind of a comparison and analysis of those, some deep interviews with change making educators themselves and other experts, and really just drawing upon the wisdom of the collective community through the years. And you'll see that these are kind of comprised of mindsets, knowledge, and skills. And I think it's important to acknowledge these before we move on to kind of embracing as a changemaker educator, because if these are the qualities that we're actually trying to educate for, we need to be grounded in those. And similarly, the adjective for changemaker educator is changemaker. And so first and foremost, we have to self-identify as a changemaker before we can bring those ideas into the classroom. And so that's why I'm spending just a little time here as we segue into more of the hat of an educator. And so here you'll see a mindset that, a changemaker identity, first and foremost, believing that change is possible and that everyone is critical as a part of that. And we saw that popping up so many times through the chat thread. Self-awareness and cultivating a sense of one's own intentions, one's own strengths, their biases and limitations, and bringing that to bear as one is attempting to collaborate with others and in teams for social impact. We also saw inclusivity and empathy showing up strongly in our chat, appreciating that for more equitable and socially just environments, we want to be inclusive. And for the kind of solutions that we need for this world, we need to bring all ideas to the table and hear from all voices. And so having that sense of inclusivity and having that deep understanding and empathy of others and what their experiences are. And then also having just a perseverance. I think that also kind of showed up a little bit in our thread, that change is difficult. And as we have even experienced as individuals in the last year and a half, that having the ability to deal with ambiguity and to kind of persevere through challenges is pretty critical for change making work. In terms of knowledge, there in the center of the slide, and Dustin hit on this really strongly as well, like the ethics of social change and having an understanding of what does responsible community engagement look like, and really helping folks to appreciate and embrace a responsibility to do no harm and looking at unintended consequences. underneath of that, there's also a need for knowledge of multiple approaches for social change. And so a Changemaker's kit of tools available to them for creating social impact, there's a plethora of things. While there is social innovation and social entrepreneurship, more classically, there's also lobbying and advocacy and philanthropy and civic engagement. And there are many tools for a changemaker. And it's really important that changemakers, they don't need to be proficient in all of them, but at least aware of the tools at the disposal and the self-awareness of where they may be most equipped to speak into, or what skills they have that they could leverage, what a situation calls for, and what teams might actually be needed to complement and to facilitate a social change approach. Underneath of that is also just a deep knowledge of systems, context, and challenges. So real immersion, I think, I'm not sure who brought it up, whether it was Rebecca or Justin, but kind of that deep systems knowledge and kind of apprenticing with and being immersed in real world problems, so that this isn't something distant and it's not just analytical or academic, but it's truly a deep understanding of power and resources and relationships and elements and how things come together to really equip the kind of systems level thinking and root cause analysis that's necessary. On the skills side, we see themes of relationships of trust, the systems thinking, creative problem solving, all of these go hand in hand, the adaptive communications, and really lifting up and empowering other people for change. And so this, for those of you who this might be kind of more of a first exposure, this may feel pretty exhaustive and overwhelming. And for others, it may be, you may feel like this is not exhaustive at all. There's things that are missing. This is really Ashoka U's kind of attempt to provide a framework and a starting point really for institutions to customize and to tailor to their own context and to draw upon. And especially we hope that can inform not only learning outcomes in a classroom context, but also broader conversations across the institution at large about learning outcomes and graduate attributes for entire pathways and for the institutional or university experience. So that's our foundation for change making. And that's the kind of first key question we wanted to get to. But let's go ahead and advance on to change making educators. And Marina, go ahead and push us on, if you would, to the, I believe it will be slide 15. So now that we kind of appreciate what change making is and kind of the key qualities that ideally we hope to facilitate in students, and we hope to first model as ourselves as changemaker educators, we want to step back and look at what are the qualities, therefore, of a changemaker educator. And so for this part, I'm going to actually lead with a conceptual frame, and then we're going to move to a panel and really just unpack that, and also invite your questions and your comments and as the panelists kind of bring some of this to life. So you'll see here that this is drawing from the guidebook that was introduced earlier, Becoming a Changemaker Institution, that the key mindset that is listed here is an identity as a changemaker educator. So very parallel, a self-identity as a changemaker, but also a belief that change is possible for and through education itself, and that actually all can have a critical impact to that. That's not just a faculty member in a classroom, sitting on a stage or standing on a stage, presenting in a lecture kind of format. But this is really something that everyone can contribute to, and that we can revolutionize and improve the educational system and outcomes. And so there's a strong passion and identity around change-making education and advancing that. In the knowledge area, if we're looking ultimately to foster social impact or help students foster social impact, there needs to be some knowledge around the local and the global realities that students will face and that they are facing currently to equip them to contribute. And I think that we have probably seen that brought to bear even more recently, the last year and a half. I think one of you mentioned in the chat about what students need right now, and kind of that one-on-one time, that coaching and that support from professors and educators Why? Because the local context has been so strenuous in the last year and a half. The global context has been very strenuous. And so appreciating that is important for the educator, both to offer empathy for student experiences and to help facilitate real world kind of application of coming up with exercises and programs and chances for students to think about how could they improve or address a specific problem. We move on to a working knowledge of change making, social innovation, and social entrepreneurship. Doesn't need to be a deep expertise, but at least a working knowledge if you're going to be infusing that and or mentoring students as they're navigating their own journey and their own pathway, as you're trying to bring to bear and to bring into life into the classroom itself. And then last under this column of knowledge is a very obvious one of discipline and disciplinary knowledge. And so having a deep understanding of one's own discipline and how that informs change-making opportunities and how one can interact with and work in interdisciplinary ways so as to solve the kind of wicked problems that we're facing. And so that's both, again, deep personal expertise in a disciplinary area, but equally important, how to analyze problems and draw from and collaborate with other disciplines in an interdisciplinary fashion. And then we move on to the kind of skills side on the right, and that's educational design, reimagining curriculum and reimagining learning outcomes and rethinking what pathways could look like so that students can navigate changemaker pathways throughout their university or college experience. And then in terms of facilitation, bringing that to bear in the actual classroom through pedagogical choices and bringing that to bear through program delivery as well. And finally, partnership collaboration, certainly partnering, I think we think classically of community partnerships, but equally important are those partnerships in the classroom with student leaders and student co-educators, with people in one's program and across the campus as you're seeking to advance change-making education. So I'm just going to pause there and we're going to be transitioning and really seeking to kind of bring to life that through, again, Dustin, Jonathan, and Rebecca's experiences. Marina, at this time, if you want to stop the slides, we could maybe focus a little bit more then on Jonathan, Rebecca, and Dustin. And Jonathan, I don't know if you can bring your camera down. It looks like it slid a little bit there. Wonderful. So we actually already kind of got a little bit into one of the first questions I was planning to ask, but I'll go ahead and ask it in case there's anything else you want to flesh out to the stories that you've already shared personally. And that was wanting to hear a little bit about your journey as a changemaker educator. So not just as a changemaker, but really as a changemaker educator. How did you come to self-identify as a changemaker educator, and how has that informed your specific approaches to teaching, to research, to service? So you provided some early influences. Feel free to amplify those, but love to hear your thoughts here.
Becky, you're still on mute, so I'll take that as a signal. I'm not sure what the answer is, frankly, Angie. I can think of points along the way, you know, a couple of years into being a professor where I embraced service learning. The time when I first heard about social entrepreneurship, several years after that, from both my wife Tracy and a student, bringing it into the classroom, beginning to collaborate with my dear co-founders, Liz Robinson and Heather Neuwirth, who are among this auspicious group, and, you know, eventually folding into the Ashoka U family. So I don't know if there was a particular moment. You know, I think in my bones, I've always felt that what an educator should do is prepare people for a life of meaning and purpose, all that good stuff, and for social change. Probably the most important educator I've had, beside the two that I mentioned, was a professor named Grace Goodell, who ran a program called Social Change and Development at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and in a very rigorous way, you know, assigning hundreds and hundreds of pages a week in our master's program. She really pushed us. We were all essentially former Peace Corps volunteers in there, to challenge what we thought we knew about social change, and brought great rigor. That was the word I used earlier in your popcorn exercise, to thinking about social change and how it's made up of the kind of connective tissue of individuals being part of families and communities and so forth. So, you know, somewhere in there, I think I began to feel it all in my bones. And I guess I just would say that I'm grateful as to have been able to take advantage of opportunities where I am at Middlebury to push the boundaries of it, of that vision. So yeah, so that's what I would say. That's my response. Thanks for the good question.
Great. Rebecca?
Yeah. So a couple of things that I've been thinking about. I first moved to New Orleans in 2005 as an undergraduate student, 2 days before Hurricane Katrina. And so that really shaped my undergraduate experience. And I think that has really been a catalyst for me in terms of identifying as a change maker. And as I was having that experience, I was able to look back on my high school experiences and realize that that's kind of the pathway I'd been starting to take. But that wasn't clear to me while I was thinking about which college I might want to consider. I also think another key moment was actually soon after graduating from Tulane in 2009. I didn't think I was going to stay in higher ed. I had plans to go to go to maybe Chicago, to leave New Orleans, to leave higher ed. And those kept getting thwarted because I was rejected from hundreds of jobs during the Great Recession, and it was totally demoralizing. But I did have the opportunity to take a 10-month fellowship at Tulane that I knew was not my ultimate career path, but I knew I could do well. And during that was actually when I met Marina and another person in here, Laura White, who was an undergrad at the time. And I had learned about social innovation as an undergrad and had kind of created my own experiences in that. And that was when Tulane was designated as a Changemaker campus. And so I knew the retreat, I knew the location where the retreat was going to be held for those student leaders. And I happened to be working for that office. So I volunteered to kind of be the on-site person that weekend. And I just asked if I could be involved. And really found myself being energized by that volunteer work that was happening outside of my class or outside of my job. And then took the risk to ask the person who was leading that initiative on campus if she'd be willing to give me a job. And then another key moment was during that time, both as an undergrad and immediately after undergrad, I had a lot of supervisors who were people of color, specifically Black men and Black women, and they just challenged me in totally new ways and introduced me to new ways of being and new ways of communicating that led me on my own racial identity development journey. And that's been an important part of my identity, both as a change maker and as a change maker educator. And then finally, I would say my relationship with my community-based organization that I work with in my class, Grow at Youth Farm, has been transformational. So that organization was using a specific EDI model in their organizational culture. And while they were thinking about the partnership between our class and their organization, they were really clear that before any of our Tulane students were allowed to join them, they needed to understand this model and their organizational culture. And that's how I was first introduced to the Visions curriculum. That Visions curriculum has transformed my personal and professional life. I use the tools that I've learned and continue to practice and continue to learn almost every single day. And I often am sharing them with folks. I know many folks in this room have heard me talk about this many, many times. But that really came from GrowDat and what they kind of felt was their stake in the ground if they were going to partner with Tulane University.
Thanks so much for that, John and Becky, as I kind of just reflect across both of those stories and experiences, like the power, not only, John, as you mentioned earlier, of kind of like your primary school educational influence, but then also kind of the rigor of working with other colleagues and other professors. And then Rebecca, and your story, just the power of your university experience itself. And beyond that, the fact that you were not only exposed in an environment and a community, but also challenged by professors and challenged by mentors. And then I love the power of the experiential, working in partnership with a community partner, how much that's been a key influence in shaping your understanding, your identity, and what you bring to the classroom. Really appreciate it. Just shows such a full suite of influences and how that shapes how we show up in the classroom. But first and foremost, our understanding of ourselves. Dustin, is there anything else that you might like to add there before we kind of keep moving?
There are a few things that, I've just come to know Rebecca and John through these panels. And there are some things that I just want to emphasize that they bring into the classroom that are just transformative. I think both Rebecca and John see students as both teachers and learners in every space. There's this sense of co-learning that is just so powerful, that empowers their students to really have voice in the classroom, have agency in the classroom, and to build and really shift the paradigm of that sage on stage framework is just really powerful. There's something else here, which is, really evident in the ways in which both John and Rebecca have talked about their teaching. It's action research at its finest. Every class, every learning opportunity is action research to each of them. They're constantly iterating. There's a sense of humility, really deep humility. And there's something that, John had raised earlier. It's that change making is not just external. Change making is not just working with community partners. Change making is internal. And there's this sense that we have that idea that it's self-work. To put it bluntly, it's spiritual work, to have this journey of understanding oneself and being able to translate that towards action. If I can just say this last piece around narrative capital, there's something about the educators that I've had that I look up to that have had the ability to hone their story, to really understand how to share those narratives, to ground themselves in their personal narrative to a point where they use it as a tool for human connection. I mean, at its core, I think change making is strengthening our innate capacities to connect authentically with ourselves and others. And I think through the courses that I've heard them describe, through the work that both of them are leading on campuses, through the work that so many Ashoka U change leaders are doing, at its core, it's fundamentally creating that sense of human connection that is just so transformative.
And can I just add a little bit to that? Because I think sometimes I've heard people kind of react of like, oh, if we're just focusing on ourselves, we're not getting to that institutional or structural level. And what I've seen is that absolutely we need to be doing all of those things simultaneously. And institutions are made up of people. And cultures are made up of people. And so we have to be changing those narratives at multiple levels, including always thinking about how I am like my own values, attitudes, and beliefs, and how I'm interacting with other people.
I'll jump in too, if I may, Justin, because as ever, your insights were so good, and humbly, thank you for your observations about the two of us. So may he rest in peace, Congressman Lewis, in his second book in particular, Crossing That Bridge, talks about at the end of the opening chapter that social change begins here. And he says the theme of that book, which documents all the work he did and the way he put his life on the line for over many years, the theme of the book is that it comes back to that hard work of looking within. And he has this delightful phrase, not his unique to him, but he uses very well. He said, each of us has in us the spark of the divine. And he's a Christian, of course, and so he uses it in that context, but it's a universal concept. And his point is that even the people who were bashing him over the head at, say, the bus station in Montgomery and other places, the Selma, they too have a spark of the divine. A thing I've learned recently, and my Middlebury colleagues know this through this class called Love in Action, is that our own students, at one of the top liberal arts colleges in the country, don't feel that about themselves. And they often, in ways that are aching to see, achingly painful, they don't have self-love. And so I have, over the recent years, felt, echoing you, Dustin, that this is my task, to help them to attain that, which is a lifelong journey, of course, but that they can't really be change makers unless they have that belief that in themselves is a spark of the divine. And it's spiritual language, which I've become okay with bringing into the classroom. And so I really want to echo that, because it's easy to get hung up in the tools of change making and models and paradigms and flowcharts and all. And a lot of them are okay. Actually, the material you shared, Angie, is fantastic. As you've heard me say before, I think that is what you have in your workbook is amazing. But it's easy to get hung up in the tools, and it's not hard to teach them, frankly. But the much harder work is, Dustin, what you began with this latest part of our session. And I will say that I think that's so important. And actually, as an educator, it's incredibly rewarding. So I would echo your all's good comments.
And just, sorry, adding to that one more time, I think in our visions curriculum, we've talked about like being and doing. And what I heard from John is like, we're so focused on the doing, and that's part of our culture. That's part of white supremacy culture, is to focus on the doing and the productivity. And so taking that time to focus on being and really appreciating each other's beings is work of anti-oppression and liberation.
Gosh, there's so much rich there. I'd love to hear, so some of those themes, just to kind of recap: student as learner, as well as teacher, and teachers as learners as well as students, right? Of a deep sense of humility, the power of lived experience, and the power of our own narratives, the importance of doing this deep personal work, personal identity and equity work, and how that shows up and manifests for us as individuals, as us nested in a classroom, as us nested as a collective in an institution itself. So many more. Help us start to unpack a little bit. How does this manifest from principle or ideal into kind of practice? How do you bring some of this into your classroom or into some of your mentorship conversations? Whether that be, you know, I'm thinking maybe Justin, you could kind of kick us off with like the student experience and their lived experience and their story. Tell us how that pragmatically plays out for you as an educator, or other principals as well. Feel free.
Angie, what a great question, right? We're asking the how. I mean, we know what the vision and what we're working towards, but how do we get there? And I think it's been interesting for me to consider that, you know, the professors that have made a profound impact on me did not just teach me their discipline, they taught me strategies on how to navigate life. And I think that's a big statement to make, but I think it's important for us to consider that so many students are entering a stage of disequilibrium. They're entering a new campus community. There are so many things happening. In this context specifically, if we look around, there's so much that students are carrying. We can't just talk about sociology, or we can't just talk about anthropology. We need to think about how we can make that learning applicable to that student's ability to navigate through crises. Right. Oh, for me, it was the courses where the assignments helped me comprehend my own role in complex systems, where I had a better understanding of inequities that I was facing, where I had a better understanding of seeing how I could pursue opportunities for social change that made a difference. I'm not saying that it needs to be a completely different conversation. I'm saying that we need to consider our higher education campuses as laboratories for change makers, as the training ground for these change makers. I think about my dear professor of organizational behavior, Dr. Mariah Besharov, who created a course specifically around social innovation to help us understand organizational behavior through the lens of campus issues. I'm thinking about educators who are understanding that, you know, multiple choice tests can only get you so far. The opportunity for students to apply learning and build those moments where they could see themselves as a change maker, build those scaffolded moments where students are actually doing rather than just thinking cerebrally about it, where we're connecting the heart and the mind together in this act of change making, where that learning is what higher education should be. So in this moment, there are so many professors that are going through my mind, but that's where I think I'll start. You know, the experience in the classroom is not just about the discipline, it's about how that discipline connects to the world we hope to create.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Dustin. I think in that one example alone, you've kind of connected a couple of themes of understanding the discipline and organizational behavior in that context, but nesting it to a current issue or reality, and that's your campus context, what was happening on the institution, and unleashing some agency for students to think about what might they change, how do these principles apply in their own context, and is there something that they might research or do about that. So lovely. Rebecca or John, love to hear kind of pragmatically. And I know for you, Rebecca, key themes I've heard from you also about systems thinking and positionality and deep identity work. I know, John, I've heard from you a lot about love in action, and self-love. What are some things you do with students to bring out either of these principles?
Becky, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. A couple of things that were coming to mind. One is that early in the semester, we talk about the role of emotions and how emotions impact our ability to actually make behavior change, and how they're often missing in the classroom. Our education system often socializes us to specifically remove emotion from it. And yet we all have emotions and we all experience those in our work, and they end up impacting our work. And so talking with students about like, how can you actually identify the emotions you're experiencing? And then do you know what those emotions are telling you in terms of what you need? And then, just this past week, I asked them to share like one emotion word as a check-in. And when a couple of folks said tired, I was like, thank you for sharing you're tired. And we want to get a little bit deeper. Is that a physical tired, or is this actually expressing feeling like really stressed or overwhelmed? And then what is that root? And then what is that root telling you? Critical reflection, I think, threading that throughout the classroom experience. So that means modeling my own critical reflection, being willing to share when I've messed up or when I've learned something through a failure, including that in assignments, but also including that in discussions and in the classroom time. And then really validating the moments when students are trying on these new mindsets for the first time, validating when they bring up a really hard question, validating when they're sharing in a way that feels really vulnerable for them, whether that's just a student who doesn't like to talk in class, being willing to be the first one to break the ice in a discussion, or really sharing kind of personal learnings that take some risk in terms of sharing more about who they are. Yeah, I think those are some of the things that are coming to mind for me.
I'll briefly share what I think I'm writing notes to 4 specific things, which are attainable to any educator to some degree or not. First of all, I did, as you alluded to a moment ago, Angie, I did a new course. It's called Love in Action. I'm actually just going to put a talk that I gave at Ashoka U a few years ago about it, because I was happy with that talk, and it gives a sense of what I'm trying to do, and it's a way for me to plug Ashoka U yet again. So, I designed a new course around my own evolving principles of social change, and with some luck, people can do that. Secondly, I am often starting courses of all kinds with meditation online. There's so many great resources. Many of you know the great work of Lama Rod Owens and his colleague, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. They've written Radical Dharma. And you can find beautiful 3, 4, 5-minute meditations that in the context of a 75-minute classroom setting, class time is time very well spent. That is a good thing to do, I believe, for all the issues we're looking at. Third is, Becky, exactly what you mentioned, and we just emulated it with our work early on, the Mad Tea Party. I did this yesterday. We had some students who were beginning to get into that hard, accelerating time at Middlebury, and I said, one word, put it in the chat in 10 seconds, how are you feeling? And then I was able to draw out a range of emotions, and that was good use of time. The fourth, I would say, related to my discipline, economics, it's not difficult to run econometric studies if you have a certain amount of training. It's also easy to forget that those data points are human beings, and that's a big mistake. And so I have been emphasizing in my environmental studies and economic courses that point, that don't forget that these are human beings that you're studying, and you must engage them. To do that, in turn, 2 things. I've actually been bringing in particular, the work of Isabel Wilkerson from CAST, who, if you read that masterpiece, you know she ends with a call for radical empathy. Says that's what we need for transformation for this century, very much echoing Bill Drayton and others. So I'm using that as a theme for one of my courses this year. She gave a beautiful talk at Middlebury, by the way, if you want to Google it. So gorgeous. It was in the spring of 2018. And then the final thing I'll say is, even when I have students doing, say, a 25-page econometric research paper, I'll say, do at least one interview, talk to people, and best, in particular, talk to the folks whose lives that you hope your research could in some way or another affect. And so that little human connection, I think, is a good thing. And there are other tools that I've adopted too, but those are a few that to go back to Dustin, your excellent formulation of the hows, those are a few that I'm using these days.
Some really, really rich ideas and specific practices. Thank you all. In a few minutes, we're going to actually kind of open it up to the rest of folks on the call, and love to hear. There's a wealth of knowledge. And so if you have been kind of sitting on a reflection, if you've been sitting on a question, we're going to be inviting that here shortly. So feel free to be thinking about that. As we start to kind of close out our time in the actual panel discussion, I think maybe just to move to, if we were to synthesize and to kind of summarize, how might we contrast traditional education with what we're proposing as Changemaker education, or what we see as lived out as Changemaker education? Love to get some of your thoughts on that.
I think one of the themes that has already been discussed is how power flows in the classroom and in the learning process. And even just acknowledging that there's power is can be subversive, and then actually trying to change those power dynamics, or allowing people to challenge those power dynamics, is, I think, something that's really important.
I think something that I'm thinking about, and something that I have thought about, is the idea that, students aren't widgets. They're vessels that we can pour into. They're vessels of all different shapes and sizes, and educators are vessels as well. And this idea that we can't treat all students the same, and the idea that we need to, approach this work from a sense of students as humans, full humans, is something that I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah, I can't add anything to those excellent comments. I would echo both of you. Thank you.
Awesome. Marina, are you able to share for us slide 17? I think what I might just have as an offering for folks, this slide that we developed actually after having had a really rich conversation between Jonathan, Rebecca, and Dustin and I at one point. And I think it's just a great summary of some of the themes that we've kind of acknowledged that, we're well beyond, and we know that, a sage on the stage. And while that kind of expertise is important within inherently with an educator, it's got to be coupled with a deep personal humility, and a vulnerability and an authenticity. And those were words that many of you reverberated, you're trying to bring to your classrooms and living out. And that prioritizing research and evidence-based knowledge is an important tradition that must be carried on. And that robust research needs to be coupled with an appreciation of lived experience, of other ways of knowing, and of other sources of inspiration and wisdom. That content delivery has been traditionally focused on transmitting knowledge, which is absolutely important. But I think Becky's honed in on this idea but there's an effective processing, kind of an emotional and personal lived experience, and acknowledging the human side as well, and giving room for that experiential exploration. that traditional education and educators have really been sound at deep problem and issue analysis. Absolutely. That Changemaker Education probably couples that with an action bias, with an opportunity for the kind of action research and experimental innovation that is coupled with a spirit of optimism that says, let's not just analyze these problems, but is there a way to mobilize vast resources and experience to attempt to solve them. And you can see here again, whether it's equipping the student to lead the change, fabulous and kind of more of a traditional approach, but then leading the change first in oneself and really owning that we've got to be the change within ourselves and modeling changemaker attributes before we're attempting to bring that to the classroom. I won't read through all of the rest, but I feel like this was an excellent summary of a lot of the themes that that have kind of come up in our conversation, but also in really the years of experience across this very rich community. I'd love to turn it over to all of you now. And so Marina, we can stop sharing the slide. If you are interested, we welcome you to be on video and love to just open it up to all. Any kind of questions that you might have for the panelists and or any reflections? Have you been sitting on an observation or want to speak into this? What insights are coming for you? And any questions as well? It's a quiet room. It's either been a long week or it's been an exhaustive conversation, one of the two. But I believe that there's so much experience in the room. If anyone wants to share another insight, Sarah, thank you for that comment in the chat. And feel free also, if you guys want to use chat to just pepper in rather than speaking up, that's absolutely fine too. I know that we've got Diana Wells also with Ashoka with us today. And so I'd actually love to just invite her also into the conversation. Diana, if any reflections stood out for you that you'd love to share with us, we welcome those. Also, as a longtime senior leader and president emerita with Ashoka, would you have anything that you'd like to offer in terms of the relevance of changemaker educators for Ashoka's broader strategy? Love to bring that into the conversation.
Thank you, Angie. I really resonated with this point of how we need to enable the students to find and ignite that spark that each of us have. At Ashoka, we've talked about the biggest barrier to change is giving ourselves permission. And I would like to just draw out from panelists further the how-tos that have worked for them to do this work, and especially now in this moment. What has worked for you?
I'll just quickly say that paradoxically, I think giving oneself permission is actually quite a collective proposition, because one cannot, in most circumstances, give oneself permission to do something unless one is surrounded by colleagues, family members, loved ones, students even, who encourage that to happen and allow that to happen. So paradoxically, I think to give oneself permission to affect change, which is a hard thing, it turns out, much harder than the words would suggest, requires indirectly at least being in a culture and a surroundings and a setting where that permission can be accessed.
If I could just comment on what we've heard from Ashoka Fellows over the years resonates exactly with your point, John, and that when we meet Ashoka Fellows and understand the journey, their social entrepreneurship journey, so many started when they were young, and it was because of someone that supported just this process. And whether it was a teacher, an educator, a neighbor, extended family member, a fellow student, it was in engagement with and resonant with some other individual that unleashed that self-permission and that step. So
something that's coming up for me is the idea of like focusing on process and also kind of revealing the process, letting students back behind the curtain, and how I found that when I am a little bit more explicit in terms of like explaining why things are designed a certain way, why we approach topics in a certain way, that that kind of metacognitive level, students have more ownership over the process, and it starts to become a collective effort. And so during this COVID time, I've definitely felt my students rally around our community as a classroom in ways that it seems like isn't happening in every single classroom. And I also think part of that is giving up some perfectionism. And being willing to share like ways I'm still questioning myself, doubts that I have, and helping students see that they don't have to be perfect in order to be a part of that community. And that's something that students are still struggling with. Even just last week, we were having a discussion where there was this underlying thread of like, I have to be perfect. It feels like it's not perfect, which means I can't contribute. And really actively working against that, which is, I think, part of our larger culture too.
I do want to recognize that we did have one question come in through the channel. I know that we're just at time, so maybe if there's just a quick reflection from a panelist, I wanted to at least honor the question. Can you elaborate more on the power dynamics in the classroom that was mentioned? So just wanted to offer that up real quick.
Yeah, I think traditionally the faculty member has all the power and gets to determine grades and can shut down conversation if they don't like where it's heading. And so I think giving students a sense that they do have some power, and also just acknowledging, yeah, I have power to change your grade, and that is real, and there's a risk here. So those are some of the things that come to mind. Also, I think power with our community partners, making sure we are compensating our partners for the educational work that they're offering, and that they get choice in the curriculum and how they show up in the classroom or how our students show up on their site.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca, Dustin, and Jonathan. What a rich conversation and dialogue. Any final words before we start to close out then?
So I am going to say a final word, please. I was looking up as we began the word bittersweet. And for so many of us, this is a bittersweet moment. The definition I found online talked about graduating from college. It's a joyous moment, but it's deeply sad because the people who you've been with, you'll never be with again in that way. And that's what's happening today. It's the last day of our last exchange. And it's a beautiful moment. Thanks to Marina, the shoulders she stands on, including her mom, who I believe is here, Aaron, and the shoulders that she stands on, Beta, Angie, so many others. We are all so thankful for what you've done. You've created a community unlike any other. It is sweet because we're all going to keep doing the work, and we will all interact in many ways in the future, but it's bitter because we won't assemble like this, even via Zoom, again, in this precise way of the way the exchange brings us together. So I would just, with your all's blessing, take a panelist prerogative to offer my deep gratitude to you all, to all the people who've enabled the exchange. It's an emotional moment for all of us. Honestly, you have really affected change in the world that we'll never be able to measure. So I would like to offer my gratitude, Marina, to you, to Angie, to your colleagues. You've changed us, you've changed the work we do with students, you've changed the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. And just to give that right back at you, right? This has been an incredible community over the years and will continue to be so. And all of these rich insights today were because of the hard work that each of you are doing on your campuses and the way that you have shared that so richly and authentically and generously for a collective wisdom and a collective learning. Diana, do you have any closing thoughts there?
Yes, of course. And thank you, John, for your comments. And I will echo them and offer my own view. You know, Ashoka U was born in 2008, 2009, in the middle of a recession. And it was in answer to demand from students that had been reaching out to Ashoka, asking us, what resources, what is this thing called social entrepreneurship that my students are asking me about? And when Marina came to Ashoka, she asked the question, what are we doing for students? And brought that perspective. And Erin, who has been here with us this week, and Beta, who has been right there, and Angie and all the others who have contributed and I've recognized are here this week with us. You have really made your scratch on history, and not just in the US. And this community will live on. Ashoka is entirely committed to having this community with us and continuing to evolve and build on this beautiful, gorgeous, important work that is making the world into a vision that we all want to live in, and a vision and reality that enables everyone to participate with dignity and equity for all. So thank you for being part of our journey over these years and your commitment to our journey ahead. So glad you could be with us. And Marina, Vida, Angie, Erin, all of the rest of you, thank you.
Awesome. Beautiful ending. Thank you so much, John, for that. Thank you, Diana. Thank you all for your participation through the chat and really for your years of dedication to this work. And anxious to see the continuing to fan the flame in all of these efforts and the movement. Have a great afternoon or evening.